today's webinar entitled Navigating the Road to Successful Market Access. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Caitlin and I'm the MedTech lead here at LSX, based in London, and I'm delighted to be sharing and hosting with you today on this webinar, the next in our MedTech Innovation series in partnership with MCRA. Before we jump into today's session, a brief introduction to LSX to those who are new to us. LSX stands for Life Science Executives. We're a community and network of senior life science decision makers across biotech, medtech, and health tech businesses, big medtech and pharma companies, the full range of the investor base in life sciences, as well as payers and providers and other key stakeholders in the healthcare sector. As well as virtual and digital content like this, many of us know us from our high-scale, large-scale conferences, partnering events and showcases that we run in Europe and the US, including our LSX World, which took place 2 weeks ago. Hopefully, some of you in the webinar today were able to join us there. In addition to this, we also have our annual US and Nordic congresses, which are both coming up later this year in September and October, respectively. We're delighted to be working with MCRA again today's session, and indeed this webinar series, as a leading advisory firm and CRO for the medical device sector, with experience across regulatory, reimbursement, clinical research, healthcare compliance, and quality assurance. They are the perfect partners for these series. Today, you're going to hear from Michael and John and Nicole, who are sharing their broad knowledge and expertise on today's topic. I'd like to give a minute or so for any latecomers to join the session before I hand over to the MCRA team who will be guiding us today. So just a couple of quick points to mention from me before we kick off. We will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation to put any questions you may have to the MCRA team. I would encourage you all to please make use of this time to ask any questions or follow-ups from the presentation. Please ask your question using the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll look to answer as many as we can after the presentation. Just a quick reminder, use the Q&A function rather than the chat function for your questions. If you see a question that you want to ask that's already been asked in the Q&A section already, you can upvote that question to show you're also interested in the answer, and we can look to address those first. So please do use this function and ask any questions that you have at any point throughout the session. So that's it from me, and I'll now hand over to Michael at MCRA to kickstart today's webinar.
Thanks, Caitlin. Harry, thank you very much. Thank you, Caitlin. So just wanted to quickly introduce MCRA and who we are. So MCRA is a global clinical research organization that does have an attached advisory consulting firm. And our goal is to be able to provide all support services that would be needed by startup companies all the way through to fully mature companies within the market. So we have a large global regulatory presence, as well as reimbursement, health economics, market access, as well as quality assurance, health compliance, and cybersecurity. MCRA has a very deep therapy specialization and integration of services. So we have our CRO and consulting firm that will help to support medical device trials, medical technology trials across numerous regions, including the United States, Europe, and Japan. We have a very high client and employee retention. We have a very successful approach with our PMA track record, as well as numerous de novo and 510K approvals. Additionally, we have our strategy implementation and due diligence support services within our global regulatory strategy group, as well as our reimbursement, quality, digital health, compliance, and due diligence supports. Our therapy specialization, while MCRA began as an orthopedic and spine company, we've actually bridged out to have therapy specializations across various different parts of the body, ranging from cardiovascular and neurology, all the way through to wound care, dental, imaging, combination products, and biologics. We've set up our reimbursement, health economics, and market access team to support a number of these. So we will actually support our clients all the way through from various stages. We have market opportunity support, where we can actually help to bring products to market. We have evidence strategy and development, landscape assessments, stakeholder engagements, as well as full service advisory and strategy support. Within our varied services, again, we range from regulatory all the way through to digital cybersecurity. For reimbursement, we definitely specialize within our strategy group. And as noted, we support all stages of various companies. We will support from startups to maturing to very well-established companies. Within startup companies, we can support, we are a holistic partner who will support our clients through their full product lifecycle. We can guide interactions with potential investors and provide transparency in the future journey. Within mid-sized companies, we'll work to support company scaling, as well as supplement workforces to expand bandwidth. So it's quite common for mid-sized and growing companies to need additional reimbursement support, and it's quite expensive for them to hire it directly. So MCRA can actually fully outsource a reimbursement department. Additionally, we provide company training to those mid-sized companies. For large companies, we can provide advisory service, specific and targeted expertise, process efficiency improvement, and bandwidth support. Additionally, we've recently taken on some investor support where we'll provide due diligence, networking, and senior advisory services. As I would like to note, we do have a world-class reimbursement leadership team. We try to hire the best of the best. So within this group, we have a number of people, but highlighted on this phone call, I will highlight Ann O'Brien, who has taken on a number of a background in economics and has worked in business development strategy roles for numerous medical device companies. At MCRA, she works with clients to understand market dynamics and reimbursement considerations as they look to commercialize their technology. Additionally, we have Nicole Fitzpatrick, who is an Associate Director of Evidence Development and Market Access. Nicole has over 15 years of experience in evidence development, spanning basic, clinical, and real-world studies. She has a deep expertise in evidence development strategies, product value positioning, and stakeholder communications. Further, we have John Schmitt, who we recently hired from the Mayo Clinic, where he was running their remote diagnostics and digital health external commercialization efforts. He spent several years in the startup sphere and payer, and recently joined us in a strategy role, where he can leverage some of his prior experience as well as some of his work with the National Blue Cross Association. So we've designed our reimbursement team to mirror MCRA's entire organization. We like to support our customers through the entire product lifecycle. We have a clinical trial reimbursement service that can actually support clients as they're going and working with our CRO. And they can support everything from CMS coverage submissions through to site education and trial generated claims and payment information. Additionally, within our strategy group, we've recently broken out our market opportunity services to provide secondary and primary market research, physician surveys, payer feedback, and pricing strategies. Our evidence services group will do evidence gap assessments and planning to help our customers develop their evidence pathway. We can also do value proposition development, which leads to economic models and value briefs. Further, we do health economic analysis and study execution to further supplement our clinical trial protocols. Additionally, our reimbursement strategy services can help with landscape assessments for coverage coding and payment. We can work to establish new codes and technology payments. We can likewise do coding strategy and applications. And then lastly, we have our patient and payer engagement services, where we can support payer coverage through our payer engagement, and then our patient access group can actually support on an individual claim level. So with that, I'll hand it over to John Schmitt, who will talk about some of the challenges with traditional reimbursement.
Thank you, Mike. So if you feel free to go ahead. So if we're looking at, the traditional reimbursement pathway, you're starting the most commonly known coding set is the CPT codes. Those are your procedure codes that physicians and outpatient facilities use to report what they actually do. The gold standard here, the category 1 CPT codes, those are the permanent codes that you see most commonly associated. You also have this set of category 3 codes. Those are the codes you sometimes see maybe with a T on it. And those are really set up for the sort of transitional situation where maybe you have a procedure, device, something like that, that doesn't have FDA clearance yet, but is doing a clinical study, or hasn't had a chance yet to show that it's a full sustainable procedure in the healthcare marketplace. Is there enough utilization to support a code? Because one thing you have to remember is it takes overhead for CMS, the American Medical Association, hospitals, payers, everyone to really support the existence of a code. Everyone has to develop policies around it, put it in their claim systems. So these stakeholders don't really want to manage codes that aren't worth managing. The other thing to consider when you're looking to commercialize a new medical technology is each of these codes come with pretty strict requirements, and there are steps you have to take. And some of these, whether it's clinical studies, utilization studies, you have to gather stakeholder support. They can take years. Just the timeline alone, you're really looking at often well over a year between applying for a code and receiving it. And that's just sort of on a category 3 side, right? Once you get that category 3 code, that doesn't really mean anything. Do you have reimbursement contracts? No, not even with Medicare. That's sort of on a one-off basis. And then when you're looking towards the category 1 side, you have to have a series of publications. There's different levels of evidence that sort of these stakeholders value. Company data is looked at with a lot of scrutiny. You really need medical society support and real coded documentation of utilization. Go ahead. So the traditional question we always look at with reimbursement is, do you use what's already there, or do you go for something new? That's sort of the standard what any reimbursement consultant's gonna ask. And each of these come with trade-offs, right? If you go for we call it stepping in the shadow, or staying in the shadows, or stepping in the spotlight. And when you're stepping in staying in the shadows, there's a lot less barrier to entry, right? You're using the coding systems that already exist. There are payments established. The coverage policies are there for the codes. They may need some adjustments, but your technology can kind of slip in. We hear from a lot of commercial payers, if there's a slightly different technology or procedure or something like that, using a code that is appropriate to use, we would never notice. A lot of that burden would fall to the provider in a sense. But the trade-off is, a lot of times there's new technology, there's new costs. You want to be reimbursed for your, R&D. You want to make money, and you want to be paid for the value that you're also providing to patients and providers and everyone else that while you're in this business. So that's what we call stepping in the spotlight. Problems here are, as I mentioned, with this process of getting new codes, it's a multi-year process. You come out of that coding process with no payments. You sort of have to start from square one there, and a lot of times that's out of your hands, right? It's you create a technology that providers use. They're the ones doing the negotiation, and you're thrown into a mix with thousands of other medical procedures that people care about a lot more on that very day. So those are sort of the main trade-offs of the traditional question. Go ahead, Mike. I think what we want to do in this new day and age is take a step back before you're even making that decision of, do you go with new reimbursement or use it? I think the most important question is, should you go down the reimbursement pathway? I think that there's the healthcare value ecosystem has been growing a tremendous amount. Cloud computing, other technological innovations have created tons of new ways that value is exchanged and value is realized in the commercial ecosystem. And it's really the actual picture of reimbursement as a total percentage of revenue and value is shrinking. Absolutely. So that's where when we look, engage with clients, I think we first, this is the first question we generally ask before we even go to the reimbursement decision. We try and figure out what is overall the right commercialization pathway, for this technology service company, but what have you. I think what's critical to, we're calling it alternative commercialization just because it's newer, that value is available now, that ecosystem circle here is growing, but that doesn't mean it's inferior. It doesn't necessarily mean it should be plan B. It may not make sense to say, oh, we couldn't get reimbursement, so we went down some other way to sell to providers or something like that. It may make sense, especially in the 21st century, that is plan A. Go ahead, Mike. Here we're going to take a look at some of the other players you should be considering. We in those early in those slides, we sort of scratched the surface as to how complicated reimbursement is. That's just one set of codes. There's countless others in different sites of service, different ways sites of services are paid. It changes in between each payer. But when you kind of expand the horizons to people that don't live in the coding world day in, day out, it starts to look much more like a generic segmentation exercise. Looking at the providers sort of at the top there, a physician's not a physician. They all have different incentives, whether they're, in part of a multi-specialty group, independent, part of a provider system, what have you. We all know there's a ton of consolidation in the industry. We've all heard that, but it looks different in different areas. In Pennsylvania, there's payer-provider consolidation with a ton of provider-sponsored plans together. In rural areas, there might be more multi-specialty groups forming or IPAs where physicians share overhead. That's a great kind of segue into that's created a lot of new middlemen that really need to prove differentiation in this marketplace. So you're talking brokers and benefit consultants, IPAs. What value are you providing to physicians? So that if nothing else, that can be a sales channel. And employers is a huge one. I think a lot of times people think employers are a shortcut to payers, but really, I think the mistake people make is thinking employers care about those generic issues any more than payers. I would always ask yourself, why is an employer outsourcing this? Don't sell your fancy new cochlear implant to Barnes and Noble or a library, right? Sell it to a mining union or something like that. Look for areas where a specific group, just like any normal segmentation, where they care more about the generic payer audience would. And the last part I think people forget are service vendors. And that ranges up to, the huge Teledocs and Amwells down to transportation vendors like MedSpeed, or even start thinking non-traditionally of how could I help FedEx win a logistics contract at the hospital. All of those folks are looking for ways to differentiate and places you can plug in. So kind of looking at this as an example lens, a hot issue right now is remote monitoring. And as you're considering, you have your technology, you have the therapy you want the patient to do. So how do you set up your business model? There's a couple different pathways you can go down. If you're on the full provider side, you're doing things like you're doing all the billing. Are you doing physician interpretation of reports? Are you making treatment decisions? You'd probably your customer acquisition model is full referrals. And then sort of on the other side of the spectrum, you have the platform where you're really it's a B2B transaction. You're providing the provider potentially the ability to do this service themselves, and hopefully facilitating that in some way. And then on the hybrid side, going back to the segmentation idea, you really got to figure out a small provider versus a large provider. What do they want to deal with, and what are they not? What are they really good at? What are they not? Large provider may want to take all the revenue activities. Maybe they can absorb the logistics, whereas a small provider, it may differ. So, Mike. So, looking at the full side of becoming a provider, on paper, it doesn't look that big, right? The traditional steps that everyone cites, you got to get an MPI. You're talking a month, you got to enroll in Medicare, sort of those check boxes. I think the thing is that people forget of how to become not a provider on paper, but a provider that can be successful in the commercial market, sell to a hospital or provide or a traditional provider. These things don't always go. There's preparation. B, there's sort of a chicken and egg problem where you have to staff up. You have to meet a lot of requirements of being a provider long in advance of actually doing your operations. There's a lot of cost and overhead involved in there. And the last piece people forget is commercial network contracting. Without that, you're essentially going to a provider and saying, hey, we can service 25, 30% of your population. You have to figure out who that is. They don't want to buy. Often there's exceptions to this, but commercial contracting for something that's very hot button in a payer's mind will still take a year. I mean, there's exceptions, there's unicorns, etc. But you're in that for the long haul before you can really be fully successful and scale in the commercial market. Go ahead, Mike. So when we're kind of going to the other side of the spectrum here on that B2B model, I think this is an example of what that might look like, where you're providing the software, the hardware, you're collecting revenue from subscription models, hardware costs, providers performing the actual clinical service. The nice thing about this is you can still, you don't have to choose if you have direct to patient business. You can still do that. It's not an either or. And I think the biggest key here is the contracting part, right? So we just talked about takes over a year. Really, there's huge risks. When you're looking at the business model purely, the biggest thing you can do is reduce that contracting burden by using your customer contracts. But I think that when you're stepping back and looking at the commercialization standpoint, you should even ask, do we need to be using contracts? Is there a reimbursement, or what other value are you going to be providing? And that's where I'd love to go next, Mike. So this is kind of a view of that trade-off. On the left is the traditional view of how someone maybe 10 to 15 years ago would be limiting this conversation of, well, what's the provider going to get reimbursed for this? Ironically, these are the brand new remote therapeutic monitoring codes, where we kind of build a model of, for a standard service where you're getting kind of one unit of each code, what does that revenue look like for the provider over time? And your decision would be, well, what if I supply the devices? I manage that. Then the provider's getting that interaction revenue, or I'm just getting the device supply revenue. I think our main thing to think about here is that leaves out the vast majority of the value that a provider is looking at. And it's not just to say, hey, have a coherent sales strategy and get your messaging right, although that's really important. The point is, even if you don't qualify for something like remote therapeutic monitoring, that doesn't mean that there's an economic value to your customer. That's what EDC is on the provider side. One thing I'd love to highlight here is the opportunity cost. All of these providers, we've all heard about nursing shortages, but it's a general trend. They are facing very steep labor supply curves in their markets. I mean, incredibly steep, especially on specialized labor, right? I mean, an example I have, Sanford Health System up in the north. They're a fantastic health system. They're one of the biggest rural providers in the country, if not the biggest. They sponsor scholarships with no strings attached for basic back office functions. Getting this labor in is very difficult. So if you can, be a remote provider, for example, in this, or take that burden off the traditional providers, you can bring huge value. Same idea with facility capacity. Rehabilitation is a great example where providers keep wanting to bundle this stuff in. It's really a necessary evil in the view of a lot of providers. If you can take that burden off and really keep the facility-based rehab to patients who would really benefit from it, that's, even without any reimbursement to the provider, you're creating a huge value for them. Couple other things I would look at here is champion fatigue. What do I mean by that? You have to make yourself easy to do business with. Your champion is, possibly a physician who really wants to do it, and they have patients. They have 20 other really cool ideas in front of them. You got to make yourself really easy for them to sell into their internal administration. So that means, whether it is a non-contracted example, you have to make it, you have to start looking at, is it going to hit their capital budgets, their operating budgets? if you have to show cost savings for them, or other revenue if it's not a reimbursement angle. That's something I think, don't take your champions for granted, for sure. But another thing to look at is the stakeholders. And I think this is going to take us to the employer groups, but think about who, a lot of times it's not enough to just say, this is better quality, therefore it's going to be better for your brands. You'll get better quality scores, blah, blah, blah. People will like you more. You really have to think about who are the real stakeholders driving patients to your system. So it's employer groups with network decisions, payers, community physicians driving referrals. It's all those groups that really, I think, matter, or often a lot more than, or at least in a lot more of a short-term sense than I think what people go in with the standard pitch. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike for a deep dive into kind of that employer and that stakeholder segment. But thank you very much.
Thanks, John. So as John noted, employer sales traditionally has been viewed as a pathway to payer coverage. And that is definitely one of the largest angles, pushing fully insured plans or fully insured employers to push their plans to cover things. However, there are other options you can undertake through your technology. And, again, it goes through showing the benefits to the employer. There's direct HR platform access. There's having that employer pay you directly to basically sell them a product and putting it right on their HR platform. One other thing that people tend to forget are employee discounts. And if everyone goes on their insurance company website today or their payer HR website, you'll probably notice a whole bunch of discounts. And these are basically products and services that are sold and to a pool of employees at that payer, generally with agreed upon prices. And what that does is that does get you a ready-built marketplace at a premium price of people who may or may not want to buy it. So these are just different avenues to take your technology to employers to make that sale. The employers do face a number of different value drivers than everyone else. Employee productivity is absolutely a major concern. Reducing absenteeism, having employees not miss work, having employees show up to work on time, do their jobs, stay for their time, increasing their productivity. Sick employees dealing with mental health issues are less productive than those who are fully healthy and not dealing with any issues. So whatever your product can do to increase their productivity is actually a major driver for employers. Lastly, reducing distractions. Somebody who has a newborn at home, somebody who has a sick spouse or sick parent, what product could you give them that would reduce their distractions, which again makes them a better employee and more productive? Another thing to remember is, at the end of a lot of this, one of the largest costs of employees is their healthcare costs. A lot of companies provide insurance coverage. They pay their premiums. So while the payers may face it, they're passing along a number of those costs through increased premiums. So where can your product improve the management of a comorbidity? How can it provide lower cost treatment? How can it help lower premium increases and keep company costs under control? These are all benefits that you can take to an employer to make your product a preferred product where either they can push it to their employees, push it to their payer, or fully cover the cost of treatment. Lastly, one other thing right now is in a very tight labor market, employee retention is huge. Whatever you can do to help them reduce their turnover, increase their benefits at a reasonable cost, and attract new talent, those are all very valuable things that you can take to an employer. If you can show that your product will improve their productivity, help control it, maybe even lower their healthcare costs and help them retain employees, you've made a massive potential impact on that employer. So demonstrating that, partnering with the employer can open up a variety of different options. As I noted, the three major approaches here are the insurance, direct company payment, and employee payment. With insurers, oftentimes companies that have fully insured services will be able to add covered benefits that they're willing to pay. I've been in a number of companies that have launched new products that did not have coverage. What was the first thing I said we need to do? Go to our insurer, ask them to cover it. Even if it was only for our 25 people, we now had a covered benefit there and basically had our company put our money where our mouth was. You can also work with insurers to control with companies to basically cover copays and deductibles for their patients for your product or your services. Again, it increases access. Additionally, one thing where I've seen companies be successful with direct company payments is where they'll directly contract. They might take on a per employee per month payment. You know, we'll pay you $1 per month for our 10,000 employees. Annual company fees, we'll just pay you X for unlimited use, or even per use fees where the company will basically just pay for the service. Large companies such as Boeing have been well known for partnering, FedEx, UPS. If you think about it, they have a lot of on-the-job injuries, so they'll actually partner with providers and technology firms to provide services for their employees when they might be injured on the job. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, employee paid benefits are actually another huge one. This is where you would contract with that employer or their benefits manager or their insurer to basically just make your product available and market it directly to their employees. There can be options for payroll deductions. You know, again, if you look at your benefits, I would bet most of you probably have a few options of things you can have your payroll deducted for, and you know, be provided a service or a benefit. So there's a varied different use here. One other thing through the kind of some of the employee paid are FSAs. You know, FSAs, HSAs. You know, these are things where the employees have pre-tax or tax-free money they can use to pay for benefits. So if you can, again, get your product into the employer, there's a variety of ways either the employer or the employee can help cover that cost. So one of the common areas that have been very frequently using this approach have been digital health companies. I personally came from a digital mental health company. We had some great success selling to our employers. And what I'd like to do now is hand it off to Nicole Fitzpatrick, who will actually talk through some examples on the digital health space and through some services that Micker can help you with.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. So I think, as Mike said, you can kind of envision how digital health products can easily fit into some of the models that both John and Mike described. However, digital health products often have a history of failure. So there's certainly not a clear and barrier-free pathway forward after selecting that as your primary business model. So this article from a few years back on why do digital health startups keep failing really, I think, hit the nail on the head. So the typical approach in the tech world is really to kind of just move fast and break things, right? So often startups will kind of push quickly to get a minimum viable product out to the market, and then we'll just iterate and improve that product based on kind of customer feedback. And that approach really does not translate well to healthcare. So digital health products really need to appeal to not just to the individual consumer or the patient, but also to a complicated landscape of stakeholders, which I know Mike and John kind of touched on during their time. So there's patients, there's doctors, there's regulators, there's insurers, there's a whole host of stakeholders that you need to kind of consider, and they all have a say in whether or not your technology is adopted. So, the wise advice, I think, from this article is that innovators should really take a deep dive to thoroughly, first of all, understand the problem, the existing solutions, so the standard of care or the competitor products that are out there in the market, and really the needs and perspectives of all of the stakeholders involved. So go ahead, Mike. So the key stakeholders really, just from a high level, the key really primary stakeholders in the healthcare space are the regulatory bodies, the payers, and the providers in the healthcare systems. So from the regulatory perspective, they're really focused on, is this product or device safe and effective, and do the benefits outweigh the risks? Well, FDA clearance does not necessarily guarantee coverage, and that's kind of the traditional, reimbursement pathway that John was referring to. So in that traditional pathway, the payers, there's going to be kind of a high threshold for getting coverage from the payer side. So they're going to look at things like, is this as beneficial as any established alternatives or the standard of care? Does it improve net health outcomes? Can you get improvement in a real world setting? And do you have high quality, robust published clinical evidence in high tier journals? And then the provider side, their perspective is again slightly different. So they're looking to understand, the clinical benefits, obviously, for patients, sufficient scientific evidence on clinical utility. So is this something that's actually useful in clinical practice and in decision making? They're going to be care maybe about the reputation, bringing on a new technology potentially could enhance the reputation. And then, those quantifiable financial benefits to the facility, which I know John touched on and kind of dove a little bit deeper on, but, are they getting adequate reimbursement? Are there things like increased volume of procedures, cost avoidance, et cetera? So that's kind of the traditional stakeholder view. Now, and go ahead, Mike. From the digital health products, then we'll face kind of additional barriers for care integration that again are specific to their products. So from if you're kind of shifting your business model, looking to maybe sell to the employer groups or payers, there's going to be sort of a host of barriers or considerations that you need to think about. So the clinical validation, of course, is there a positive cost and utilization impact from their standpoint? Are you going to have high employee or member engagement and long-term employee or member engagement? There's cybersecurity, HIPAA regulations to consider. Can you kind of establish a low per employee per month or per member per month cost to adopt the technology and still, be financially successful as a company? Do you have seamless employee and member data exchange? You may be facing short-term contracting windows because maybe you're just the flavor of the year or the flavor of the week from their perspective, and they may want to flip to something new in the future. And then there's often an extensive vetting process for inclusion on a digital formulary, which I'll touch on in the next slide. But from the provider perspective, it's going to, there's going to be other considerations that you should really think about. So the physician and buy-in and physician champion may be difficult to obtain. So it's kind of depending on the level of engagement that you need from the in-network provider. Especially if it's a remote monitoring device, for instance, you may need some high provider engagement because they may need to be viewing that data or monitoring the output of the digital health product. So you may need to have the strong buy-in from your physician. However, you may be viewed also as a competitor potentially to those network providers. So you really need to kind of think from the provider point of view. Is there workflow integration? Are you impacting the time or personnel burden on the provider side? Can you get real-time communication with the network physician for seamless patient care? So, if you're making clinical recommendations through the digital health product, are those being translated to your network provider? Do you have EHR integration? Again, the cybersecurity and HIPAA, et cetera. So the list goes on. And again, these are just examples. And then from the patient standpoint, the end user, they may have a very different perspective as well. So is there good usability? Can the patient or user successfully navigate the software or wearables if wearables are involved? There may be technology burnout. So this may be, the next thing in a long list of technologies that they're using in their healthcare environment. So, you may need to consider, the ease of use, technology burnout. Is there frustration? Are you going to be able to achieve that long-term engagement from the patient standpoint? They may be reacting also to a disconnected or uncoordinated care with their network physician. So, I've seen that a lot, that products may fail because patients trust their network providers. And if it's not coming recommended from their network provider, or they're feeling that the care is disconnected, they may not use it. So, again, the list kind of goes on. There's a lot of considerations from each stakeholder perspective. Now, this is an example from CVS Caremark from their digital health formulary of the extensive vetting process. So this kind of touches on that, if you're looking to be included into one of these digital health formularies, you may face kind of a very rigorous vetting process. So you can see there's several categories, including clinical review, security review, business review, and then of course, ongoing monitoring of the performance and outcome of the digital health product. So there's kind of a high bar to just become incorporated and accepted into one of the digital health formularies. Go ahead, Mike. So then focusing in on just the evidence requirements. So what type of evidence do you really need then from the stakeholder standpoint? So all of these stakeholders, so the employers or payers, if you're looking at them as your customer, they're going to care, of course, about safety and efficacy. You're going to have published and robust clinical trial results, published in peer-reviewed journals. And that holds true for the network providers, whether they're your primary customer or not. They're still going, if they're whatever their level of engagement, they're going to want to see that safety and efficacy data. And then the patients, of course, will care about the clinical safety and efficacy data. But going back to the employers or payers, they're going to want to see some quantified, member experience and engagement data for sure. So you're going to want to establish, long-term potentially engagement, positive engagement metrics. And then financially, there's going to be some evidence that's required in terms of cost savings or from the per member per month or per employee per month standpoint. And then just employee or member satisfaction and productiveness. So I know Mike touched on this a little bit. You may want to show that the employees are being more productive, missing less work, and things of that nature. So you should start thinking about collecting those types of metrics in addition. And then from the provider standpoint, I do feel like it's going to really depend on the level of engagement that you require. But one thing I think that jumps out is clinical utility. So does this impact the clinical decision making? So, from the provider standpoint, are they saying, this is nice to have information that's coming out of this product, but I'm not really going to use it for anything. And I think that is something that is definitely worth exploring and definitely having a clear answer to as you sort of move forward in your product journey. And then, another thing that I think is sometimes overlooked, it sort of fits into that clinical utility bucket, is just physician confidence. And I've seen this in the diagnostic space where, maybe you're getting some interesting results, but maybe the physician doesn't feel confident acting on them. And they may say, okay, this is nice to have, and I think I may trust this information, but I'm still going to put that patient down the standard of care treatment or diagnostic pathway. So maybe they just sort of overlook that and they move down, and your part of your value messaging is, oh, we're going to reduce future diagnostic tests, but the physician actions actually don't reduce that additional burden. So, it's really important to understand, are your physicians going to be confident in interpreting and utilizing this information? And then again, from the patient standpoint, you should certainly have some, patient satisfaction data, engaging, rewarding. Patient vignettes are always, a good thing to have from the patient perspective. So go ahead, Mike. And then this is an example of evidence of MSK offerings on digital formulary at Evernorth. So these are 3 examples, and really the numbers here aren't important, but the message here is that each of these has very strong data in 3 different categories. So clinical benefits, patient engagement, and network benefits. And so, you can see that they have, very, robust data in each of these categories. And importantly, they have actually published in peer-reviewed journals for their clinical benefits. So, this is just a really nice example that the evidence here is, curated to the specific stakeholder interest, published in peer-reviewed journals. So they have achieved a really high level of evidence. Okay, go ahead, Mike. So clearly there's really a need for strategic evidence development across the product lifecycle that focuses on specific stakeholder needs. So our goal, at MCRA is really to allow the key stakeholders and decision makers to see the value of the product based on their needs. So the approach that we use is strategic evidence generation and communication of value-based evidence to the right audience at the right time. And the process that we use is first to, evaluate. So, to identify any gaps or unmet needs according to the key stakeholder interests, and then use that information for strategy and positioning. So developing your value proposition in a very much a stakeholder specific manner, and then going and collecting the evidence that's needed to support those value propositions. And then you can go and communicate that evidence out to your stakeholder groups. And importantly, there's a need to sort of continually reassess this as your product progresses down that product life cycle, and really iterate on each of these areas as you progress, because there's changing factors in the market. And I think Anne is going to speak a little bit more about some of those market factors. So I'll pass it over to her.
So I think when we think about market access and market opportunities, to what John and Mike and Nicole said, we have to think about the different category of stakeholder and then what's needed in each category. So when we think about the payer, as you've heard from my colleagues, it's very important to, after you do the initial assessments, to determine if there's current coverage, coding, and payment, to see if those are appropriate for your devices, and then look at, if they're not, what clinical evidence is needed. And I think a lot of people might stop right there and say, okay, we don't have the coverage that we need or the codes, and get a bit discouraged. But I think it's always important to understand, when you look more broadly at the market opportunity, that you can position your product in different ways. So even if there isn't an existing code, you can still then go to the next category where you're more focused on the provider, meaning the hospital or the facility, and looking at ways to generate evidence to show the value proposition to the hospital, whether it's different cost savings or improving patient satisfaction or even staff satisfaction. There's many different ways to look at technology, and it doesn't always have to fall within the traditional reimbursement standpoint. So that's when we think about the payer and the provider. And then outside of that, there's many, for example, digital health technologies that could be targeted directly to the patient or business to business. And those don't have as many, I would say, barriers to entry, and it's a different sort of evidence that you might need. So when we look at market access and market opportunity, we can help, go through each of these scenarios and see what makes most sense. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, only one. We can look at different ways to target all of the stakeholders. And then, if you could go to the next slide, Mike. As we look at then the different times in a product's life cycle, we're also looking at market assessments and market opportunities and determining, even very early on, where it might fit, considering the different standard of care and competitive offerings, and then always going back to the stakeholders to determine where is an unmet need and where could a product provide most value. Even with a small tweak early on to a design, it could really help as we think of early stage products. And then as we're getting a little bit closer, the design has been finalized, and then the client is looking to see where it fits within the US market. This is when we will take a closer look at the coding coverage and payment along with the competition, and see what business model might really fit for the different stakeholders. And once that's determined, as we think about a launch plan, we can look closer at insurance payments when applicable, look at different list prices of competitors, and really determine the right launch strategy. So this is just to show how we can blend all the considerations that my colleagues spoke about, and really go through the different phases with our clients. I know we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'll turn it back to Mike and John for questions.
Sure, thanks, Anne. So I'll try to be brief with my closing, but so, a lot of you will ask, so what with all of this? What we've observed over the last 6 months is investors are becoming much more interested in not just the idea, not just the vision, not just the here's how we can change the world, but a little more concerned about how they're going to get their cash back, how you're going to turn your product into a successful commercial product. And really, this is something that's important. We see a lot of technologies that unfortunately just are not reimbursed, that are in a state that may not be reimbursable to a point that makes them commercially viable. So we started to look at, what are some alternative things we can do? And there are a lot of alternative strategies we've, detailed that will basically say, if you're not reimbursable or you're not going to be successful with reimbursement rates, what else can you do? Now, there still are a lot of reimbursement pathways, but I think there needs to be a focus on what else can be done. And we've tried to outline a lot of those things today. So I know we have 10 minutes left. I will hand it over to John to moderate some questions.
Thank you, everyone, for submitting questions. They're fantastic, really, really fantastic questions. So we're going to try and get to as much as we can here quickly. First, Nicole, for you. So the question is, original question, will providers accept non-US clinical data that was directed to payers? I think maybe just a few comments on some of the stakeholders we talked about and the importance of that, payers and maybe providers and other stakeholders.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we talked to a lot of payers here at MCRA, and kind of the resounding response is usually payers do want to see US data. And that's not to say that they won't consider data from outside of the US, but I think that they definitely want to see data within, if you're having like a multi-site clinical trial, for instance, at least one or several of the sites should be located within the US. And then I think the same from the provider side, although they may be a little bit more open to accepting non-US data. But yeah, I don't know if anybody else has comments on that.
What we've go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, I would agree with Nicole there. Oftentimes it's a focus on US-based data. Definitely carries a lot more weight, and that's what we've seen within our expert that we've reached out to as well.
So while I have you, Mr. Mike, are there any stats on how much time is lost by one employee attending a doctor's office or clinic? What factors are built into the cost, or excuse me, built into how much cost could be saved by avoiding a single attendance episode?
Sure. So I actually did this in my last company. We factored a number of things. You've got not just the duration of that appointment, but you've now also got travel time. So my last company was acquired by Amwell, so we were solidly into the telehealth space. And what we actually did is focus on the travel time. Well, if it takes an average of a half hour just to get to that appointment, and then they sit in the waiting room for 15 minutes, and then they sit in the room for 15 minutes waiting to see their doctor, then they have their appointment, which could be, let's call it a half hour. And then they have to drive home or back to their place of work for a half hour. Now you're adding up that time, and you can have a half hour visit take 2+ hours. So there are a lot of factors you can build into that. We've looked at it on a customer by customer basis. We've looked at it in generalities, but there's a lot of different pieces that you can add up the time. And now you can look at, what is that employee's salary? Let's face it, generally you're not hiring an employee unless you're going to benefit more than their salary. So that's a pretty good proxy and pretty much a minimum value. So say that employee makes $20 an hour. Simply them being gone, the lack of productivity you've seen now is worth $40. Now this is a gross oversimplification, but you can build that in and show that by having that visit eliminated, not just are you not going to see the cost of that visit, which again would be billed, you would see that lost productivity, that lost time. And there are a number of different factors that can be built in there.
Any other panelists comments on that? Okay, back to Nicole. When is the right time to start planning for evidence generation for alternative stakeholders? I'll add traditional stakeholders.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think as early as possible. It's never too early to start, especially collecting stakeholder feedback through primary research. So, we recommend, interviews, surveys of those stakeholder groups to really start to understand, what are the value drivers that they're considering around your technology. And then you can start to sort of build your evidence development strategy around that. But it's always good to continually go back in and reassess and check in with those stakeholder groups as you progress throughout the life cycle, because there's also, sort of extraneous market factors that are changing all the time and should be considered and continually, sort of monitored.
So as a quick follow-up, so, the FDA is making me jump through all these hoops, studies, safety and efficacy, all that. Are those the commercial side of that evidence generation and the regulatory side? Are those things I can think about at the same time, or do I have to wait until that's over?
Yeah, I mean, I think you should think about them at the same time for sure. I mean, and sometimes there's often, some parallel evidence collection activities that you can do as you're moving through that regulatory pathway. So, if you're planning for, your clinical trial for, for regulatory approval, you may be able to build in certain endpoints, for instance, that, payers or other stakeholder groups may find valuable, even if it's, at a preliminary level. It can provide fuel for future evidence or study development. So yeah, I think absolutely considering, the commercial pathway along with the regulatory pathway in parallel is very, very valuable.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on that, John?
Yeah, please.
Sure. So it's actually quite important to be doing those in parallel, because what you don't want to have happen is you get your regulatory approval, you go to sell a product, you hire a bunch of salespeople, you pay them top dollar because they've got great connections, and they go out and they start trying to sell a product, and they can't sell it because there's no payment or a bad reimbursement pathway or no commercialization pathway, or the coding is not clearly laid out. Then what you've got is you're burning a lot of cash, and you're paying those salespeople, and they're missing their quotas. And you're trying to explain to your board why your results are not there. And what ends up happening is then you come to a consulting firm like ours, we say, how do we fix this? And that's time and money. And when you're having that burn, you don't like to see that. And by starting earlier, effectively what you can do is when you're ready to commercialize and you've got a product, you get your regulatory approval, you're ready to commercialize. You can give your salespeople something in their bag they can go successfully sell, because they've got a message, they've got a plan, they can communicate to their buyer what the value they're getting is. Is it a reimbursement code? Great, here it is. Is it an alternative pathway? Is it some other clinical benefit? Yes, no, maybe, but they need to communicate something. Otherwise, you've got a very expensive sales force that just cannot sell the product.
Thank you. And question for you, can you comment on the option of having a wellness product in addition to a clinical grade FDA device?
So I think that for each of them, you want to consider who the stakeholder is. So if you have an FDA cleared device, is that something that would be utilized for remote monitoring, and a provider would be involved, and then your wellness app would be marketed directly to patients? And I think they should have two slightly different maybe software components, so that they are clearly two distinguishable devices, and then you can have different strategies for both, and different business models as well.
So we're going to stay on for an extra minute to maybe answer another question or two, but I'm going to let Caitlin and LSX do a quick wrap up and logistics. But we'll stay on to answer a couple more.
No problem. Thank you so much, guys. We are running to the end of the session today. I know that I can see that there's plenty of questions for the MCRA team, and I just want to say a quick thanks for them joining our session. We will be sending a follow-up email to all of you who are registered as soon as possible, which will include a link to the full recorded webinar. As John mentioned, they are staying on a couple of minutes to answer a few more questions, but do feel free to reach out to the MCRA team. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to discuss the content of the presentation and any ways they may be able to help you and your business after the webinar. I'll pass back over to the MCRA team now to answer a couple of questions before we wrap up today's session. But thank you again for all of us, or for all of you joining us today, and hope to see you again at our LSX event soon.
So a really good question I have here is, how do you envision value-based reimbursement models continuing to evolve in the coming years? I think this is something maybe everyone should touch on from a somewhat different perspective, and maybe we close on this quickly. I think from the payer side, this has been something that's the buzzword in all aspects of healthcare having to do with payment for a decade. And I think the reality is they haven't quite, the fee-for-service model, cost-based model has not been displaced at the speed that anyone would think is the case. You're seeing small little business models jumping up, direct primary care. You're seeing Medicare doing additional capitation style or bundled payments, things like that. But the upside risk sharing, downside risk sharing is not really taken place outside of ownership consolidation. So you do see it when a provider or a payer do consolidate, and then you have a bunch more aligned incentives. I think the huge barrier is that the providers are not willing to take downside risk. I think from a commercialization standpoint, this is a great alternative. If you're looking at, the value you could get on reimbursements from a code, and it's looking pretty low. This is a great way, if you can somehow enable those arrangements to take place, you can go to a provider or a payer and say, hey, we can make you willing to take downside risk, provider or payer, we can, inject this into a value-based payment, we can cost save on this way. That is an alternative, non-traditional coding reimbursement pathway, a lever you can pull. If anyone else wants to talk about alternative payments, value-based payments, anything like that, please do.
Sure. I think you touched on something very important. It's who takes that risk. I've seen a lot of payers who are willing to take upside, very few who are willing to take downside. That was something CMS tried to do 8 or 9 years ago. They rolled out their alternative payment methods, and a lot of providers were not willing to sign up and take downside risk. So that's something that has definitely been a big blocker to the adoption. The other question is, how do you define value? This is kind of more that philosophical question. If you go try to find the best surgeon, how do you define it? Oh, they've got the best stats. Well, do they only take easy cases? If you only take easy cases, you can have good stats. Or do you look for the guy with horrible stats, very hard cases? So again, with value, it's hard because you know it when you see it. I can tell you when I see value care. I can tell you when I see good results, but putting a hard and fast rule on it is very difficult. And when you start talking of billions of dollars and pretty soon to be trillions of dollars, know it when you see it. It's not going to be enough to make that work. And until somebody can really define how that is, value-based care will still fail to displace fee-for-service.
Yeah, and I'll add to that because I think, Mike, that's the really relevant point is how do you define value, and then kind of the next question is how do you then generate the evidence that shows that value, right? So I think the first step is definitely defining it, and maybe it's kind of around the quadruple aim in healthcare, and I think that's kind of the direction maybe things are going, but how do you then generate the appropriate evidence to support that value? And maybe it's, more emphasis potentially on like patient reported outcomes, for instance. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see sort of how that evolves over time.
One last one to go around the horn on, I think, I think maybe the most important question here is, how are VCs and investors thinking about alternative commercialization? Are they comfortable with non-reimbursement pathways? I think in this tight money environment that everyone's sort of getting back used to, no longer can you have a really cool technology and worry about the monetization later. I think people are very worried about it. I personally see it as a really good opportunity for technologies, businesses, startup companies, new products that have a very coherent path to cash flow and revenue, whether that's reimbursement, whether that's alternative. I don't think that is as much of a concern to investors as do you have a coherent plan to cash flow? I'd love to go around the horn on that, see if folks agree or disagree. Anne, would you kick that off?
Yeah, I think generally we're hearing very early on that investors are looking at both reimbursement and business models and really want to understand what that looks like before they've even sometimes thought about the FDA pathway, right? So I think it's something that's become increasingly important in everyone's early plans before they even raised initial funding. So that's the trend that we're seeing.
I've definitely seen it in talking to companies and investors. You know, that it's reimbursement's great because it's kind of what's known. But if you've got a coherent plan in a way you can explain why someone will buy your product and can prove that, it's viewed just as well. So, you know, do we bring a value? I mean, if you think about it, think of an exam table. Every doctor's going to go buy them. It is not reimbursable. You know, there's a market for it. So, hey, hospital needs it, hospital wants it, we've got the best one, we can sell it at a good price. That could be a great story that can help raise money. So, you know, the VCs, the investors, they just want to know that there is a viable commercial pathway. And, you know, that might not be reimbursement, that might be value, that might be employer paid, that might be direct to consumer. But if it's there, if there's a good path, they can be interested at the right price.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have too much additional to add, but I mean, I just think that, you know, the VCs are going to want to know that you've done your homework, right? I mean, you've got to do your homework. You have a solid business model. You've evaluated it from all stakeholder perspectives, and you have a story to tell each of those stakeholders, and sort of the evidence to back it up. So I think that's kind of the general trend.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. So I know we ran a couple minutes over. I thank everybody for joining us. If anyone's got any questions, we can be reached out to directly or at info@micra.com. Caitlin and the LSX team will probably be sending out some contact information for us as well. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Big thanks.